The Bank of Canada is seen cutting rates faster as they completely lose control and are completely behind the curve. So the Bank of Canada is seen cutting rates deeper, faster over next year. Obviously, we've got the rate announcement, which comes out tomorrow. That'll be very interesting to see what they say. Obviously, the central planners met at Jackson Hole for their annual bash. Economists see the Bank of Canada cutting interest rates for a third consecutive meeting next week. Obviously, that's this week now, continuing what's anticipated to be a steady downward trend in borrowing costs over the next year as inflation eases. Again, Bloomberg is just going along there, basically saying, oh yeah, the soft landing's going to prevail. They're not going to be cutting rates fast like the yield curve is saying. Everything's going to be okay, and they're just going to slowly rescue this economy, which is completely collapsing and has been, like we've been saying. Policymakers led by Governor Tiff McClellan are expecting to lower the benchmark overnight rate to 4.25% at their September 4th meeting, according to the median estimate in an August poll conducted by Bloomberg. Yeah, I'm not really sure if it really matters that much, but anyway, 50, 25, we'll see what happens tomorrow. Economists are also forecasting faster and deeper cuts to borrowing costs over the next year and see the central bank reducing the policy rate from the current 4.5% to 3% by next July in 2026. The overnight rate is expected to average 2.75%, the data shows. And then it basically shows how the previous survey, they're now saying that they're going to be cutting rates faster. Obviously, we think this is interesting on this channel because so far this year, we've seen sustained CPI inflation, which means inflation is doing a lot worse than what we're seeing here. We've obviously got the unemployment rate that is going up, and just to make things even worse, we've got nearly 1/4 of Canadians will use food banks in full. I mean, this is coming from Stats Canada, so take this with a grain of salt. It's probably way worse than they are predicting here. But obviously, if you can't afford to feed yourself, I don't think there is any other way of describing a total economic collapse than when your population can't afford to put food on the table. I mean, it's just quite frankly insane how people don't see that. That is literally Great Depression stuff. You've got people lining up for the food banks exactly like they were lining up for bread and soup back in the Great Depression. So it's absolutely insane what is happening right in front of people's eyes, and they don't even realize it, half of them. It's just crazy to me, but when it hits them, they'll sure realize. So an alarming number of Canadians, about 23%, say their finances are so bad that they'll have to rely on food banks this fall, according to Statistics Canada. And I'll add and say here that a lot of people don't track their finances. They don't know how much money's coming in. They don't know how much money's going out. They don't know that they're actually falling more and more behind each month because they're not doing the budgeting. That is just one simple thing that people can do to prepare, so they know where exactly they have room, if any, to cut their budget on certain things so they don't have to spiral into debt like so many people unfortunately are, because credit is just so available in this country. So findings from the current analysis show certain groups are experiencing greater financial strain due to rising prices, including those with lower incomes, younger adults, households with children, and persons with disabilities. Obviously, you're seeing more vulnerable groups of people in a much worse position, which unfortunately is generally what happens in these sort of cycles. The research showed that 23% said they were likely to obtain food or meals from community organizations in the next 6 months. I mean, this is baffling. This is Canada-wide statistics, guys. So it really just shows how this country is in a depression, and it's just crazy. So among low-income households, the number was much higher, with 42% of poorer households saying they were likely to use a food bank this fall. I mean, we covered yesterday how the Surrey food bank has ran out, essentially, of food. Are we going to see this happen more and more and more? And unfortunately, with the increase of people using food banks, you've got people taking advantage of the situation, which I think is really, really bad. People that don't need to rely on food banks but are going there because they made terrible financial decisions and they refuse to actually cut their living living standards and would rather take food off the table from somebody else who desperately needs it. And I really think that food banks need to do something about that because it is running rampant in certain places in Canada. When asked about financial related stress, more than 1/3 of Canadians, 35%, describe most days as quite a bit or extremely stressful due to financial issues, wrote StatsCan. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out when you've got people saying stuff like this. What does that mean for your banking system? You've built an economy on credit card debt, household debt in terms of mortgages, lines of credit, business credit. It's not just households that are in debt. It's private businesses are over 300% in debt on average in Canada. It's absolutely crazy. So when you hear these shocking statistics, you've then just got to take that to its logical conclusion, which is where is that debt held? It's held as assets on the Canadian bank's balance sheet. Because there's an oligarchy of the banking system and because people don't like change, you've got a lot of that debt held at 5 institutions in Canada. And when you've got the quality of the people using that debt deteriorating so bad, the credit quality, what does that really mean if their assets were marked to market, as in they were actually marked at the price you would have to sell them these days to get rid of those loans? They would be worthless, essentially, because the credit quality of a lot of, especially credit card debt, is just unbelievably low right now. And it's just getting worse and worse as people are digging further and further into a financial hole, unfortunately. And rate cuts isn't going to help them. So over half of households with children, 55%, reported rising prices were greatly affecting their ability to meet day-to-day expenses, said the report. Extremely shocking, and obviously another reason why the birth rate is going to be so low and remain so low in Canada is when you have things like that are happening. So really interesting as well. We've been looking at macro business articles for years, and they are fantastic as they do a lot of comparison between Canada and Australia, mainly talking about the Australian economy. But Canada and Australia are so similar. You have to ask the question, is that really a coincidence? You've also got New Zealand that essentially is doing the same thing when it comes to mass immigration and collapsing living standards. So Canada and Australia have resorted to quantitative peopling to give the illusion of growth while individual living standards are collapsing. Canada has recorded the largest population expansion in history, with nearly 1.3 million people added over the past year, almost all via net overseas migration. And you can see on the chart, you had this deficit that happened. And this is basically just a chart of rent prices as well. We've shown the correlation is just to a T there. While this massive population expansion has kept Canada out of a technical recession, GDP per capita has collapsed and is now tracking to similar levels to a decade ago. You can see on this chart how you're going back to levels seen in 2013, 2014 as the standard of living collapsed. On Friday, the National Bank released research on Canadian retail sales, which are growing slowly in aggregate terms, but are collapsing in per capita terms. And again, if you look at this, real retail sales per capita absolutely collapsing. And just remember, guys, this is adjusted for the phony CPI. Can you imagine how fast these are collapsing if you adjusted it for real inflation numbers? You know, it's just mind-boggling how quickly this economy is imploding if you just realize how manipulated and corrupted the data has become that we get from agencies like Statistics Canada, which try and make the economy look better than it actually is. And they do that for a reason, guys. They do that to make the government's debt look better, and it means there's more of an appetite for that debt, which props up the currency more. The situation is similar to Australia, which has also grown its population at a record pace on the back of net overseas migration. So you can see they had exactly the same thing happen. It collapsed during 2020, 2021, and then they went and just flung the door wide open, and it's just skyrocketed since. And then you look at GDP per capita, it's collapsed, but not as bad as Canada. So you can see the exact same thing is happening in Australia that is happening with Canada. And again, I ask you, is that a coincidence? Do you think this is going to change if the government changes. Again, we're looking at an entirely different country. Do you seriously think if you change the government, things are going to change drastically? The virtue signaling is going to change. And obviously, you might have somebody talking that you agree with more, but it's a case of what they actually do, not what they say. I mean, it's just crazy. And we'll continue to monitor that. So Australia retail sales volumes have also collapsed in the face of high interest rates and the cost of living crisis, with discretionary retailers hit hardest. And you can see exactly the same things happening. Per capita retail trade sales are just collapsing in Australia. And it's just unbelievable that you have this correlation between two countries that couldn't be further apart when you really think about it. And then you've also got Skip the Dishes and Just Eat cutting 800 jobs amid a Canadian restructure. So you've got more and more people who are losing jobs in this industry, which is really interesting because obviously if there's not much profit in that industry, and obviously that has boomed since 2021, is this yet another victim of the bullwhip effect and the Canadian recession, where they saw all this growth as a result of what happened during the pandemic, and now all that growth is unwinding, so they've got to unwind all the jobs. They've got to unwind all those people that they took on. So many industries will be affected in the same way by the bullwhip effect. So the chief executive of Skip the Dishes says hundreds of Canadian employees are being laid off by the food delivery service and its parent company. Paul Burns says 100 Canada-based workers will depart Skip the Dishes. Some 700 staff also in Canada who work for its owner, JustEatTakeaway.com, will also lose their job. And that's interesting because that is in the UK. JustEat.com is big and popular in the UK. It's basically the sister to Skip the Dishes. It's called Just Eat in the UK. So obviously you're not just seeing Skip the Dishes volumes unwind, you're also seeing the same thing happen across the Atlantic Ocean in the UK. So it's unbelievable when you think about these things. Different countries again, same things happening, and you've seen very similar things happen throughout this time. And obviously now you've got the Bank of England that's also cutting interest rates. So very, very interesting, guys. So anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, I'd highly recommend that you check out this video here. And if you're looking to protect your privacy, you might want to consider a VPN from the best VPN provider, ExpressVPN. Affiliate link in the description, expressvpn.com/marketmania. I will see you in the next one. Take care, guys.